Brian thinks that 1/2 and 1/4 is equivalent because they both have a 1 in the numerator's place. Angie thinks that 1/4 and 2/4 are equivalent because they have a 4 in the denominator's place. We're going to use some pattern blocks to decide who is right. We are going to use our hexagon as our whole, and then we're going to use our trapezoids and our rhombuses to represent the parts of a whole. It takes 2 parts to make a whole. So that means that this is 1/2 and this is 1/2. Now for the rhombuses, which are going to represent 1/3, so we have 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 equals 1 whole. So it takes 3 parts to make a whole. If we focus on just one part of each of the fractions we just talked about, 1/2 and 1/3, let's forget about those for right now. These both have 1 in the numerator's place because this is 1/3 and 1/2. What's different is their denominator. With the halves, it only takes 2 parts to make a whole. With thirds, it takes 3 parts to make a whole. The half is bigger than the third. So just because there's a 1 in the numerator does not mean that the fractions are equivalent. You have to look at the denominator. Angie's theory was that 1/4 and 2/4 are the same because the 4 in the denominator is the same. So for this, we're going to make a square out of 4 equal parts. 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. That equals our whole. So here we have 1/4. And here we have 2/4. So if we look, they both have the same denominator of 4, but the numerator is higher in our 2/4, and 2/4 is a greater part of a whole than 1/4. So now we're going to test Angie and Brian's theories using fraction tiles. So Brian says that 1/2 and 1/4 are the same because the 1 in the numerator is the same. So here we have the fractions labeled for us, 1/2 and 1/4. If we look at the numerator, they are the same. They both have 1, but that's because this is one part of a whole, and this is one part of a whole. What makes it different is the denominator. It takes 2 parts to make a whole. With a fourth, the 4 in the denominator means that it takes 4 parts to make one whole. When we line them up, we see that 1/2 is still bigger than 1/4, even though they share a common numerator. It's the denominator that makes a half bigger than a fourth. Now for Angie, she says that 1/4 and 2/4 is the same because the denominator is the same. So we have 1/4 plus 1/4, which equals 2/4. And then we have a fourth above it. We can see if we line them up that 2/4 is greater than 1/4 because since the denominator is the same, we have to look at the numerator to see which is greater. 2 is greater than 1, so 2/4 is greater than 1/4. So now we're going to show this on a number line. So we're going to use red to show 1/2 and blue to show the fraction 1/4. So 1/2, it takes 2 parts to equal 1 whole. So we're going to draw 1 mark here, 1 mark here. And since we're labeling the fraction 1/4, we're only going to go to the half mark, 1/2. Now for 1/4, here it shows that it takes 4 parts to equal 1 whole. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 parts, and we're labeling 1/4. So right here we have 1/4, and right here we have 1/2. So even though the numerators are the same, the denominators are different, and 1/2 is larger than 1/4. Now we're going to do the same with 1/4 and 2/4. So it takes 4 parts to make a whole. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. And here we're going to label 1/4. So if we go 1/4, it will be right here. Now the next fraction is 2/4. Now we already have our number line broken up into 4 parts of a whole. So we just need to go to 2/4 instead of 1/4. So 1, 2/4. And if we look at our number line, we can see that 2/4 is larger than 1/4.